The Cygnian Hegemony did not arrive with the subtle hum of explorers. They arrived with the predatory roar of an empire that considered the universe a ledger to be balanced. 500 shimmering, gold-plated warships materialized at the edge of the Sol system, their hulls adorned with the intricate filigree of the galactic tax conglomerate. At the center of this display of financial might sat the Great Audit, a dreadnought capable of glassing a planet if its property taxes were even a cycle overdue. Exarch Malcor of the Cygnian Hegemony stood on his bridge, his forearms folded behind his back, his secondary eyes tracking the dull, gray speck on his view screen. It was a moon designated as the Silent Watch, a seemingly worthless rock orbiting the outskirts of human-controlled space. "Report!" Malcor commanded, his voice a series of clicking harmonics, translated into perfect galactic standard. "The human colony is unresponsive, Exarch," his tactical officer replied, gesturing to a screen showing minimal electromagnetic activity. "The facility is a low-yield mining moon. Atmospheric composition is toxic. Nitrogen and oxygen mixed with industrial pollutants. A typical human death world outpost." Malcor gurgled a sound of contempt. For 73 cycles, the humans had been the galaxy's polite janitors and favorite punching bags, performing the hazardous labor others avoided and settling disputes with quiet efficiency. He had studied human psychology and noted they were the type of species that apologized even when they were the ones being hurt. But this time, a minor trade discrepancy involving agricultural exports had gone unpaid. Malcor was not here for the credits. He was here to demonstrate that no species, no matter how helpful, was exempt from the hegemony's reach. "Open a channel," Malcor ordered. "Tell the primitives their eviction begins now." The holographic display flickered to life, but instead of a panicked commander or a pleading diplomat, the Cynians were met with the image of a middle-aged human male in a short-sleeved shirt. He was seated in a cramped, dimly lit office, calmly reviewing a digital ledger while a ceramic mug of steaming brown liquid sat at his elbow. "This is Gideon, maintenance and records," the human said, his voice carrying an exhausted certainty that made Malcor's scales itch. "You're early. The schedule says we aren't due for a review for another 3 cycles. "I am Exarch Malcor," the alien roared, leaning into the camera. "Your species owes the hegemony 17 million credits in interest penalties. We are seizing the Silent Watch as collateral. You have 10 minutes to begin your jump sequence to Earth, or we will assume you are choosing a more destructive demonstration." Gideon didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from his screen. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Exarch," Gideon said pleasantly. "This moon isn't a mine. We don't export anything from here. The debt you're looking for was paid in blood by our ancestors during the last war. This isn't a property. It's a maximum security storage facility." Malcor's mandibles clicked with amusement. "Bluffing is a sign of a weak species, human. Our scans show no weapons, no shields, and a crew of exactly 12 people. You are primitives playing with shadows." "We aren't the crew, Exarch," Gideon said, finally looking directly into the lens. His eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with a profound, weary pity. "We are the locks, and you are making it very difficult for us to keep the doors closed." Malcor turned to his tactical officer. "Deploy the extraction team. If the humans won't leave, relocate them piece by piece." The first Cygnian boarding pod struck the moon's surface with the force of a small meteor. As the elite extraction team stepped out onto the gray dust, their sensors finally registered an anomaly. The station's internal AI didn't sound an alarm. Instead, it broadcast a single low-frequency message across the entire Cygnian fleet. Inside the station, Malcor watched on his monitor as the lights in Gideon's office shifted from a soft yellow to a deep, pulsing crimson. Gideon sighed, set down his coffee, and pulled a key from around his neck. "You really should have just knocked first," Gideon whispered. The extraction team of the Cygnian Hegemony moved through the airlock of the Silent Watch with the mechanical precision of apex predators who had never known a true challenge. Led by Captain Vorn, the 6 armored warriors stepped onto the cold, pressurized floor, their multi-spectrum sensors scanning for the 12 humans Gideon had mentioned. But the corridors remained empty, bathed in the rhythmic red pulse of the Auditor's protocol. Aboard the Great Audit, Exarch Malcor watched the live feed from Vorn's helmet. His skin rippled with satisfaction as he saw the humans' lack of conventional defenses. "They don't even have automated turrets," Malcor remarked to his bridge crew. "It is as we suspected. Humanity has spent so much time playing diplomat that they have forgotten how to guard their own secrets. On the surface, Captain Vorn halted his team. They had reached a massive, seamless vault door deep within the moon's crust. It wasn't made of standard alloy. The metal seemed to absorb the light of their flares, a dull, hungry black. Above the door, a simple, handwritten sign in English was taped to the control panel. "Seriously, go away. You don't want to see what's behind door number 1. Captain Vorn, bypass the lock." Malcor's voice hissed through the comms. "I want that ledger. I want to see the blood debt this human spoke of." Gideon's face appeared in a small floating window on Vorn's HUD. He was no longer looking at his ledger. He was leaning back, staring at a bank of monitors that the Cygnians couldn't see. "Captain, I'm going to give you one last piece of professional advice," Gideon said, his voice dropping to that level of calm that humans reserved for the edge of a cliff. "That door isn't locked to keep people out. It's magnetically sealed to keep the pressure in. Not air pressure, existential pressure." "Your metaphors are as primitive as your species, Gideon," Malcor interjected from the bridge. "Open it." Vorn placed a Cygnian molecular torch against the seal. The black metal didn't melt. It groaned. A sound like 1,000 dying stars echoed through the corridor. As the seal broke, a blast of freezing, sterile air rushed out, carrying a scent that no Cygnian recognized, the smell of ozone and ancient, dried earth. The team stepped inside. Their lights cut through a darkness so thick it felt like liquid. They weren't in a storehouse. They were in a museum of horrors. Rows upon rows of glass containment units stretched into the gloom, each holding a different nightmare. A vial of gray goo that shimmered with a mind of its own. A suit of power armor that seemed to be made of living, pulsing veins, and a single vibrating tuning fork that caused the Cygnian's armor to crackle with static. "What is this?" Vorn whispered, his confidence finally flickering like a dying lamp. "This is Earth's Plan B." Gideon's voice echoed over the station's speakers, no longer polite. "In 2090, we realized the galaxy was full of empires like yours, predators who mistake patience for weakness. So we spent 50 years building things we promised ourselves we'd never use. We called them the unforgivable specializations." At the end of the hall, a single massive tank sat bathed in a pale blue light. Inside, something moved. It was humanoid, but its limbs were too long, and its skin shifted between solid matter and a dark, swirling smoke. "That is Subject 01, Gideon said quietly. "He's been asleep since the siege of Mars. He's very hungry, and he's been dreaming of debt collectors for a long..." Vorn's sensors suddenly screamed. The subject had placed a hand against the glass. The glass didn't break. It simply ceased to exist, turning into fine white sand. "Exarch!" Vorn shouted, his voice cracking with a terror his species hadn't felt in millennia. "The entity! It's..." The feed cut to static. The bridge of the Great Audit was a symphony of static and suppressed panic. Exarch Malcor's secondary eyes twitched as he stared at the blank screen where the extraction team's live feed had once been. On the surface of the silent watch, the Cygnian biomonitors had not merely faded. They had vanished from the tracking grid as if the elite warriors had never existed at all. "Restore the connection!" Malcor bellowed, his feeding tentacles curling in a display of mounting agitation. They were elite collectors. No primitive human mining crew could neutralize them in a span of seconds. "It isn't the crew, Exarch," the communications officer stammered, his skin turning a sickly, transparent green. "We are receiving a priority transmission from the Human Records Office. It is a formal automated notification." Malcor snatched the datapad, expecting a plea for mercy. Instead, he found a cold, clinical assessment. The document stated that the Cygnian Hegemony was being assessed a cleanup and containment fee for the unauthorized release of ancient biological hazards. Failure to pay in 10 standard minutes would result in the immediate commencement of asset liquidation. Malcor laughed harshly. "They threaten the hegemony with accounting terms? We have 500 warships. We are the ones who liquidate assets." The holographic display flickered and Gideon reappeared. He was no longer looking at his digital ledgers. He was methodically cleaning the lenses of a pair of spectacles with a sterile cloth. Behind him, the crimson lights of the station pulsed with a rhythmic intensity. "Exarch, I'm going to be very direct with you," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a flat, exhausted register. "Humans are generally a very patient species. We like order, we like rules. We even like paying our debts when they are legitimate. But you didn't come for a debt today. You came for a trophy. Gideon put his glasses back on and looked straight into the lens. There is a concept on Earth we call the Annoyance Protocol. It is the final warning we provide to species who mistake our table manners for an inability to wage war. When I said we were the Locks, I was not being poetic. My team and I are the only thing that keeps humanity's unforgivable specializations from deciding the galaxy needs a fresh start. Empty words from a primitive custodian, Malcor hissed, though he felt a primal chill of warning. You see, that is the core of your problem, Gideon replied with a sharp, cold smile. You think this is a war. To us, this is just a very messy industrial accident in the making. And now, I am actually getting quite annoyed. Suddenly, the Great Audit groaned. It was not hit by a missile or a conventional plasma beam. Instead, the ship's own internal gravity generators began to fluctuate wildly, as if the moon below was pulling on the hull with a localized hunger that defied every fundamental law of physics. "Report!" Malcor screamed, as his command throne tilted. "The moon! It is not rock, sir!" the tactical officer shrieked, his appendages flying across his console as the sensors overloaded. "The energy signature is shifting. It is not a geological formation. It is a living, biological magnetic field. It is reaching out to our reactor core." On the view screen, the surface of the Silent Watch began to ripple like liquid. A massive, metallic iris was opening in the center of the largest crater. An iris large enough to swallow a cruiser whole. "Exarch," Gideon's voice came through the chaos, hauntingly calm. "Meet the debt collector. He does not accept credits." From the opening iris, a single obsidian spear of energy shot upward, piercing the hull of a Cygnian destroyer as if its advanced shields were mere tissue paper. The ship did not explode. It simply collapsed inward, turning into a dense, silent marble of compressed scrap. Malcor stared in silent horror as Gideon took a final, slow sip of his coffee. 9 minutes left on that cleanup fee, Exarch, Gideon said. I would suggest you start checking your pockets. The bridge of the Great Audit was no longer a place of imperial command. It had become a gallery of high-tech impotence. Exarch Malcor watched in frozen silence as the obsidian spear from the moon's surface retracted, leaving behind a shimmering trail of ionized particles where a proud Cygnian destroyer had stood moments before. On the tactical map, the Cygnian fleet was beginning to scatter, their highly advanced formations breaking under the pressure of a localized gravitational pull that shouldn't have been physically possible for a celestial body of that size. Inside the winding corridors of the Silent Watch, the last remains of the Cygnian extraction force, Team Delta, were learning a very different lesson about human logistics. They were not being hunted by soldiers or biological horrors, not yet. They were being picked apart by the station itself. "Report! Status of Specialist Kroll," the team leader barked into his comms. Static was the only reply. Kroll had been standing near a standard industrial cargo lift when the Annoyance protocol initiated. The lift, designed to move multi-ton mineral crates, had suddenly accelerated to terminal velocity without a sound, pinning the armored Cygnian against the bulkhead with the casual weight of a falling mountain. There were no alarms, no warnings, only the soft, mechanical hum of a facility performing routine maintenance. "He's gone, Captain," a second Cygnian whispered, his multi-spectrum visor flickering as the station's internal sensors began painting target icons over their own biosignatures. "The automated systems, they aren't malfunctioning, they're optimizing." In the records office, Gideon adjusted his spectacles and looked at a secondary monitor showing the industrial accident logs. He reached out and pressed a button marked Ventilation Override. "You see, Malcor?" Gideon's voice echoed through the Great Audit's bridge and the station's corridors simultaneously. "Humanity doesn't just build weapons. We build environments. We spent centuries on Earth learning how to make the very air and ground work for us, or against our enemies. You call this an invasion. To my automated safety systems, you are simply unauthorized debris that needs to be cleared from the hallways." Another Cygnian screamed as a high-pressure fire suppression system triggered in a hallway that contained no fire. Instead of water, the nozzle sprayed a concentrated, super-cooled liquid nitrogen mix. The elite warrior was turned into a brittle statue in less than 3 seconds, shattering into thousands of crystalline fragments as he collapsed to the floor. "That's 4, Gideon noted, his voice sounding like a bored accountant at the end of a long shift. 6 minutes left on the cleanup fee, Exarch. I'd advise you to look at your long-range sensors. You're so focused on what's inside this moon that you've forgotten to check what's coming from behind you." Malcor pivoted his secondary eyes to the rear tactical display. His skin turned a translucent, terrified gray. Emerging from the shadow of the Sol system's outer gas giant was not a human warfleet, but a single massive vessel designated the Balance Sheet. It carried no visible cannons, but its energy signature was massive enough to cause sensor blackouts across the entire Cygnian fleet. "What is that ship?" Malcor demanded, his voice cracking. "That's the Logistics and Cleaning Fleet," Gideon replied, finally standing up and smoothing his beige shirt. "They don't fight. They just process the remains. And they've brought the Varsity Reclamation crew with them." On the surface of the moon, the massive iris began to glow with a sickly green light. Something was rising from the depths, something that had been liquidated centuries ago and was now being recalled to active duty. "Exarch," Gideon whispered. "Subject 01 is out of his cage, and he really hates being interrupted during his nap." The screen on the Great Audit suddenly showed the interior of the station again. The last Cygnian of Team Delta was backing away from a dark corner, his weapon shaking. A pair of long, pale hands reached out from the shadows, and the feed went pitch black. Exarch Malcor felt his primary and secondary stomachs drop simultaneously into his lower abdomen as the tactical display on the Great Audit began to flicker with impossible data. The balance sheet had reached its designated position, and it was not deploying fighters. Instead, it was launching thousands of autonomous, spider-like reclamation drones that swarmed toward the Cygnian fleet like a localized asteroid belt. "Why aren't they firing?" Malcor roared, his mandibles clicking in a frantic rhythm usually reserved for a total security breach. They aren't trying to destroy us, Exarch," the tactical officer whispered, his voice trembling as he watched the drones attach themselves to the hulls of their cruisers. "They are using high-frequency sonic resonance to identify structural microfractures in our armor. They aren't shooting. They are disassembling us." Gideon's face reappeared on the main view screen, his expression the kind of unreadable mask usually reserved for watching someone try to drink molten metal. He had picked up his ceramic mug again, the steam rising in the quiet office of the Silent Watch. "You asked about the blood debt, Malcor?" Gideon said, his voice carrying the exhausted certainty of 30 years of diplomatic service. In 2090, humanity realized that war is not about bravery or honor or superior firepower. War is about logistics, resources, and mathematics. He gestured vaguely at the holographic map showing the Cygnian fleet being systematically dismantled. "We defeated our own planet through accounting. We calculated the supply lines of extinction, and we balanced the ledger. You are not a threat to us. You are simply a resource we haven't recycled yet." On the surface of the moon, Subject 01 was no longer a shadow in a corner. The entity moved across the gray dust with a fluid, terrible grace that should have been biologically impossible for a creature of its size. It did not use an environmental suit. Its skin, a shimmering, iridescent sheen, seemed to absorb the vacuum itself. "What is that thing?" Malcor breathed, his optical sensors focusing on the humanoid figure that was now leaping toward the nearest boarding pod with the force of a kinetic strike. "That is the result of what happens when you spend millions of years being hunted by things bigger and meaner than you," Gideon replied, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "Subject 01 is an apex predator born from a planet that actively tries to kill its inhabitants every single day. We didn't build him. We just stopped him from being the only thing left alive on Earth." On the tactical map, the Cygnian cruisers were beginning to drift. Their reactor cores hadn't been hit by weapons. They had been optimized into dormancy by the reclamation drones. The ships weren't exploding. They were simply becoming silent, frozen monuments to the hegemony's hubris. 5 minutes left on the cleanup fee, Malcor," Gideon said, looking at his chronometer. "And I should mention, the logistics fleet just finished calculating the scrap value of your flagship. It's remarkably high." Malcor slammed his appendage on the command console, but the buttons remained dead. The Great Audit was no longer responding. He looked out the bridge window and saw Subject 01 standing on the hull of the neighboring ship, looking directly back at him with eyes that burned like fusion reactions. "We surrender!" Malcor screamed into the dead comms. "We will pay the debt. We will pay anything." "Oh, Exarch," Gideon said with a cold, unsettling smile that showed too many teeth. "We already told you the debt was paid in blood. Now, we're just here for the interest." The massive iris on the moon's surface suddenly emitted a low-frequency hum that made the hull of the Great Audit vibrate. A second spear of energy, larger than the first, began to coalesce. But it wasn't aiming for the fleet, it was aiming for the jump gate the Cygnians had used to enter the system. "You're locking us in," Malcor realized, his skin turning a flat, pale white. "No," Gideon corrected. "We're just making sure nobody else interrupts our conversation. And trust me, Malcor, this is going to be a very long conversation." Subject 01 suddenly vanished from the view screen, only to reappear a split second later, his hand pressing against the reinforced glass of the Great Audit's bridge. Reinforced bridge glass of the Great Audit, designed to withstand the heat of a supernova's edge, did not shatter. It didn't even crack. Instead, where Subject 01's hand touched the transparent alloy, the atoms simply rearranged themselves, turning from a solid barrier into a shimmering, permeable haze. The entity stepped through the ghost glass as if walking through a morning mist, bringing with it a silence so absolute it felt like the bridge's atmosphere had been sucked into a vacuum. Exarch Malcor scrambled backward, his forearms flailing for a sidearm that had already been remotely deactivated by the station's AI. His elite bridge guards leveled their pulse rifles, but as they pulled the triggers, the weapons didn't fire. They hummed with a low, mocking frequency and then began to melt into slag in their hands. "Don't bother," Gideon's voice came from the bridge speakers, sounding as though he were merely giving a lecture on office safety. "Subject 01 doesn't vibrate on a frequency your weapons can interact with. To him, you are just static. A background noise he's about to turn off." Subject 01 tilted its head. It had no face, only a shifting, bioluminescent mask of swirling pale smoke that mimicked the features of those it looked upon. For a terrifying second, Malcor saw his own panicked eyes reflected in the entity's void-like head. "Wait!" Malcor shrieked, pressing himself against his command throne. "We are the Cygnian Hegemony. We have trade treaties. We have rights under the Galactic Accord." "You had rights," Gideon corrected, his image on the view screen now standing in a brightly lit hallway of the Silent Watch, walking toward a massive elevator. "But you filed a forced asset acquisition claim against a Level 7 restricted biological preserve. In legal terms, Exarch, you didn't just break into a house. You broke into a laboratory and tripped over the Do Not Touch signs. The Accord doesn't protect you here. It protects the rest of the galaxy from you." Subject 01 reached out a long, tapering finger. It didn't strike Malcor. It touched the command console. Instantly, every screen on the bridge and every screen on every ship in the Cygnian fleet switched from tactical maps to a live feed of the Cygnian homeworld, Cygnia Prime. The golden cities and floating gardens of Malcor's people were peaceful, unaware that 500 light-years away, their greatest fleet was being erased from the ledger. "What are you doing?" Malcor gasped, his skin turning a translucent, bruised purple. "Me?" "Nothing," Gideon said, stepping into the elevator. "But the Varsity Reclamation crew just finished their audit. They've determined that 17 million credits won't cover the emotional distress and environmental damage caused by your little repo mission. They've decided to secure the balance from your primary holdings." On the screens showing Cygnia Prime, thousands of tiny black pinpricks began to appear in the planet's upper atmosphere. They weren't missiles. They were the same spider-like reclamation drones that were currently eating Malcor's fleet. "You're attacking our home?" Malcor whispered. "Attack?" "No, Malcor, that's too expensive," Gideon replied. "We're simply placing a lion on your planet. Your cities, your energy grids, your orbital shipyards, they now belong to the Earth Logistics and Cleaning Department until the debt is settled. And since we charge interest by the second," Subject 01 suddenly turned away from Malcor and looked at the bridge door. It hissed open. A team of humans in heavy, white industrial suits walked in. They weren't carrying guns. They were carrying scanners, clipboards, and heavy-duty industrial vacuums. The leader of the team, a woman with a name tag that read Henderson Reclamation, looked at the horrific, smoking entity of Subject 01 and gave a small, respectful nod. "Good job, 01. We'll take it from here," she said. She then turned to the trembling Exarch. "Mr. Malcor, I'm going to need you to step away from the throne. We need to inventory the upholstery before we begin the hull stripping." Malcor looked at the entity, then at the cleaners, then back at the screen showing his planet being swarmed by drones. The sheer, terrifying mundanity of it, the way they treated his empire's fall as a weekend chore, was more breaking than any weapon. What happens to us?" Malcor asked. Henderson looked up from her clipboard. You're to help us. We have a lot of paperwork to process, and Gideon says you're quite familiar with ledgers. But first..." She paused, looking at a flashing light on her wrist-mounted computer. "We have a bit of a problem. It seems Subject 01 didn't just come here to help us." The entity, Subject 01, began to vibrate. The smoke within its skin turned from pale blue to a violent, hungry orange. "Gideon!" Henderson barked into her comms. "The entity is reacting to the Cygnian reactor core. He's not staying in the helpful phase." "Oh dear," Gideon's voice came back, sounding truly worried for the first time. "I forgot to mention, he's very sensitive to Cygnian power frequencies. If he absorbs that core, he won't just stop at the bridge. He'll use the ship's jump drive to follow the drones to Cygnia Prime." Subject 01 let out a sound that wasn't a scream but a rip in reality itself. The vibration coming from Subject 01 was no longer a sound. It was a physical displacement of reality. On the bridge of the Great Audit, Henderson and her reclamation team didn't reach for weapons. Instead, they reached for specialized reality anchors on their utility belts, slamming the devices onto the deck plates to keep themselves from being phased out of existence. Exarch Malcor watched, paralyzed, as the orange glow within the entity's skin began to pulse in sync with the ship's failing reactor. Every time the core throbbed, Subject 01 grew larger, his translucent limbs elongating, his face becoming a swirling vortex of Cygnian star charts and screaming nebulae. "Gideon! He's reaching the resonance point!" Henderson shouted into her comms, her voice straining against the roar of the ship's internal systems being torn apart. "If he integrates with the jump drive, he'll be on Cygnia Prime in under 30 seconds. The drones won't have anything left to inventory." In the station elevator, Gideon didn't speed up. He stood perfectly still, watching the floor numbers change. "I told him," Gideon sighed, his voice echoing through the bridge speakers. "I told the Exarch that we are the locks. But once the lock is broken, you can't just put the key back in and expect everything to be fine. Subject 01 isn't a soldier you can order to cease fire. He is a biological response to an external threat. And right now, Malcor, your entire civilization is being categorized as a threat." Malcor fell to his knees, his forearms trembling. "Stop him! We renounce the claim! We will give you Sector 7! We will give you the trade routes! Just make it stop!" "It's not about the credits anymore, Exarch," Henderson said, her eyes fixed on her scanner. "You brought a power source, your reactor, that Subject 01 hasn't tasted in 300 years. To him, you're not an empire. You're a battery." Suddenly, the bridge doors hissed open. Gideon stepped out. He looked remarkably ordinary in his beige shirt, holding a small silver remote that looked more like a garage door opener than a weapon of mass destruction. He walked past the screaming Cygnians and the frantic cleaners, stopping exactly 3 feet away from the towering, orange-hot entity that was Subject 01. The entity turned. The swirling vortex of its head focused on Gideon. The heat coming off the creature was enough to melt the gold filigree on Malcor's throne. Yet Gideon didn't even break a sweat. "Enough, 01, Gideon said quietly. "The audit is still in progress. We don't destroy assets until the paperwork is filed. You know the rules." The entity let out a sound like a tectonic plate snapping. It leaned down, its face inches from Gideon's. For a heartbeat, the bridge held its breath. Then the violent orange glow began to fade, receding back into a calm, pale blue. Subject 01 shivered, its form shrinking back to a humanoid shape, and it stepped away from the reactor console. Malcor let out a sob of relief, but it was short-lived. Gideon turned to the Exarch, his face devoid of any warmth. "He's calm for now, but there's a problem. To stop him from jumping to your homeworld, I had to redirect his hunger somewhere else. I had to give him a new target to focus on while we finish the reclamation." "What, where?" Malcor stammered. Gideon pointed to the view screen. The obsidian spear on the surface of the Silent Watch wasn't glowing green or black anymore. It was glowing with the same violent, hungry orange that had just occupied the bridge. The spear wasn't aiming at the ships, it was aiming at the very fabric of space where the Cygnian jump gate stood. "The spear is now a beacon," Gideon explained. "It's broadcasting your empire's unique genetic and electronic signature across the void. It's not just a weapon anymore, it's a dinner bell. And every other subject we have in the lower vaults just woke up and heard it." As if on cue, the moon's surface began to shake. Not one, but dozens of irises began to open across the gray dust of the Silent Watch. "You said there were 12 humans on this station," Malcor whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "There are," Gideon said, checking his watch. "And we are the only ones keeping the other 4,000 residents from following that signal back to your capital. But my shift ends in 20 minutes, and the night crew is notoriously lazy about the locks. Gideon leaned over the console and pressed a single button. The fee just doubled, Exarch, and I suggest you pay it before the sun sets on Earth. Or I'm letting go of the leash. The silence that followed the opening of the lower vaults was not empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the collective breath of 4,000 things that the universe had tried and failed to kill. On the bridge of the Great Audit, the air grew cold enough to frost the Cygnian officer's scales. Even Subject 01 stood perfectly still, its bioluminescent skin dimming to a respectful, somber violet as the neighbors began to stir. Exarch Malcor watched the tactical monitors. The moon's surface was no longer gray rock. It was a shifting carpet of movement. Thousands of entities, some no larger than a human hand, and others the size of heavy tanks, were emerging from the irises. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like biological glitches. Masses of teeth, eyes, and shifting geometry that defied Cygnian classification. "They're following the beacon," Malcor whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Your dinner bell is calling them to my home." "That's the nature of a lien, Malcor," Gideon said, his voice flat as he leaned against the command console. "If the debtor can't pay, the collectors go to the source. And believe me, Subject 01 is the only one in that vault who has any manners. The things coming out of Level 9 don't even know what surrender means." Henderson, the reclamation leader, stepped forward, tapping a final command into her wrist link. Suddenly, the orange beacon on the moon's surface flickered and died. The dinner bell was silent. The entities on the surface paused, their horrific forms twitching in confusion as the signal vanished. "Why?" Malcor gasped. "Why stop it?" "Because," Gideon said, pulling a folded piece of thermal paper from his pocket, "the logistics and cleaning fleet just finished the appraisal. Your empire is lucky, Exarch. Your flagship's reactor is rare, your hull plating is high grade, and the orbital shipyards over Cygnia Prime are worth exactly 18 million credits in scrap value." He handed the paper to Malcor. It was a receipt. "The debt of 17 million is settled," Gideon continued. "The extra million covers the cleanup fee for the biological release you caused. You are officially balanced. The lien is lifted." Malcor stared at the paper. His fleet was gone, dismantled into neat piles of raw materials currently being loaded into the holds of the balance sheet. His empire's wealth had been vaporized in a single afternoon, but his planet was still there. His people were alive. You destroyed my military for a trade discrepancy," Malcor said, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and profound relief. "No," Gideon corrected him, standing up straight and fixing his beige shirt. "We destroyed your military because you tried to open the cage. We don't care about the credits, Malcor. We care about the locks. Humanity spent 1,000 years trying to forget the monsters we made to survive our own history. We put them on this moon so they would never hurt anyone again. We became polite so we wouldn't have to be them." Gideon looked at Subject 01, who was now fading into a semi-transparent state, ready to be escorted back to its containment unit. "You didn't meet Earth's warriors today, Exarch," Gideon said. "You met our mistakes. And the only reason you're still breathing is because humans are the only species in this galaxy kind enough to keep our mistakes in the dark." Henderson's team began ushering the surviving Cygnian crew toward the few remaining lifeboats. They weren't being taken as prisoners. They were being sent home with enough fuel to reach the nearest jump gate and a very clear message to deliver to the rest of the hegemony. Gideon walked back toward the airlock, pausing to look one last time at the broken golden bridge of the Great Audit. He tapped his comms. "Station AI, reset the annoyance threshold to level 1. Secure subjects 01 through 4,000. And someone get me a fresh pot of coffee. This one's gone cold." As the human shuttle departed, the last thing Exarch Malcor saw through the lifeboat's small window was the silent watch. The gray moon looked peaceful again, a silent tomb in the black of space. But now he knew the truth. The humans weren't the polite janitors of the galaxy. They were the world's most dangerous zookeepers, and they were very, very tired of poking the bars.